afternoon. Welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And now, with no further ado, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel, I should say. I've spoken about it a few times, but I'm asked usually by Stacey to give a sort of a title, a working title for this tonight's webinar on Saturday night. So again, sometimes I write something because that's what's an issue, maybe over the end of the previous week, Thursday or Friday. Don't forget, in Israel, the weekend starts Friday and Saturday, as opposed to in the US and the UK and elsewhere, Saturday and Sunday. And so basically last week, there was the latest attack, a terrorist attack against an Israeli Jew by a Palestinian Arab. Not all of them have been Palestinian, some of them have even been Israeli Arabs. But there was a spate of terrorist attacks, what some define as lone wolf, meaning that many of these people did not belong necessarily to a terrorist organization, even though sometimes post facto groups like Hamas take responsibility, or they congratulate the people for the attacks. You saw the attack, which got a bit of news when it happened outside the Old City, when an ultra-Orthodox man was stabbed. That was the previous Saturday. And then he was shot on the ground by Israeli soldiers. A lot of people, a lot of Palestinians or anti-Israel activists spliced the video to make it look like just someone was sitting around and then they were shot, when actually they tried to stab a few people with quite a nasty knife. Well, a few days later, we saw the latest attack in Sheikh Jarrah, Shimon and Sadiq neighborhood. Those of you who've been following the news, earlier in the year, ostensibly the Hamas-Israel conflict earlier in the year was partially, at least, claimed to be about what's going on in Sheikh Jarrah. If you remember, there's a number of buildings in that area which were originally owned by Jewish families pre-state. And then when that area was taken over by Jordan, these houses where the Jews had to flee or expelled were then handed over to some Palestinian families who have been living there ever since. And a number of years ago, Israeli organizations who bought it off the family who originally owned it took the Palestinian families to court, and they ruled that they should hand it over, and then there was an appeal. So this process is winding its way through the Supreme Court, and it caused quite an international outcry, if you remember. And Hamas used it to garner support for what then became the latest conflict, the flare-up. That particular neighborhood, there's still a lot of tensions, and there was a woman who was walking her children to kindergarten when I believe a 14 or 15-year-old girl walked behind her and took out a big kitchen knife and stabbed her in the back. Thankfully, the woman was not too seriously injured. She did go to hospital. The assailant fled to school, and apparently the school wouldn't give her up, but the army had to go in and get her out. But that was just the latest. I think there was 5 or 6 attacks in the last couple of weeks. And a lot of people are asking, is this going to be something like what we had a few years ago when there was a lot of lone attacks? And thankfully, I have to say, at least, there hasn't been an attack this week, not a successful one at least. All the time, the Israeli security officials, police, army, border patrols are stopping and preventing attacks. So that's not to say that there are no attacks, and almost every day there's some sort of rock throwing or maybe petrol bomb throwing on some of the roads in Judea and Samaria, but there hasn't been one of these stabbing attacks now for about a week. So that was what sort of was the title. of the webinar for this week. But the question is what actually is going on in these areas. And what we can see is that Hamas is trying to gain a foothold in Judea and Samaria. As we know, Hamas control the Gaza Strip, and Fatah, in theory at least, control. Fatah is Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian President's Party, and they control, ostensibly at least, Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Actually, on the ground, there are many areas where neither groups are necessarily in control. It's the local authorities. Sometimes the sheikh, sometimes it's on clan rule. But in the big cities, what we have seen is Hamas are trying to make a big play for taking control. And Fatah are trying to beat them back. As much as they both are not big fans of Israel, to put it mildly, they are not necessarily, they're rivals. They don't like each other. They're both trying to take power. So we've seen Fatah really try and clamp down on Hamas. What we haven't seen for quite a while, is Hamas openly parading through the streets, through Palestinian major cities with not just their flags, but also rifles and arms and weapons. And this was more than a signal to Israel. This was a signal to Fatah. So perhaps that, with the ongoing incitement, the terror payments, things like that, is probably behind what's going on at the moment. The ground in Jerusalem, in certain areas at least, is still a little bit tense, even from earlier in the year. And there are people who try to take advantage. Hamas are certainly interested in turning up the heat. They've said that if their demands are not met on Gaza, then they will perhaps return to what they claim is the military option. In other words, firing rockets at Israeli population centers in the south, and really stirring things up in Jerusalem and the West Bank. At the moment, it really isn't having too much of an effect on the Israeli political scene. What has had more of an effect this week, which has split the coalition, as we've spoken quite a lot about. This coalition has strange ideological bedfellows. So far, they've been able to keep it under wraps. They've been able to really ensure that these ideological differences haven't come to the fore. But one, let's say, relatively minor tweet this week certainly brought them to the front. Omer Bar-Lev, who is the internal security minister in charge of police and things like that, had a meeting with a deputy secretary of state, I believe, and he quoted that during the meeting, what was discussed, one of the things that was discussed is what was described as settler violence. And for that comment, he was praised by some of the more left-wing members of the government. On the right, in the Yamina party especially, he was condemned, especially as what I said before, in the backdrop of the fact that there have been numerous Palestinian terrorist attacks in the last few weeks, that the fact that there was a discussion with a senior foreign official, especially from the American administration, and they spent at least a certain amount of time on what was described as settler terrorism or settler attacks, obviously outraged the right. And that really did cause a bit of back and forth. Interestingly enough, on that, when Benny Gantz, the defense minister, was in America to talk about the Iran nuclear negotiations and Israel's point of view, and reportedly, according to certain media outlets, to describe what an Israeli potential attack would look like, and the fact that they are preparing for that, at least preparing the strategy in case that was necessary. There were a lot of reports that said that during the meeting with Secretary of State Blinken, as much time on what Israel would describe as an existential threat, in other words, the Iranian nuclear weapons capability, Secretary of State Blinken, and again, I stress this is according to reports, wanted to spend as much time talking about settlements in Judea and Samaria. In other words, the building of Israeli homes over the Green Line was just as important to some of the most senior members of the US administration, as basically trying to coordinate what would be an existential threat to Israel. And as you can imagine, even there were foreign ministry officials who also went on record and said there seems to be an obsession with settlements at the moment. We want to talk about Iran. We want to talk about the fact that Iran is weeks, maybe months away from nuclear threshold state being able to enrich uranium to 90%, which is weapons grade material, which in theory should be a red line. Again, like we discussed a couple of weeks ago, it doesn't mean that necessarily that there's a missile ready. The capability to attach it to a missile could take up to 2 years, if not longer. But the fact that they will have grade material means that that technological threshold has been met, and that is a very dangerous moment. So in Israel, the defense, security, and political levels are very worried about this. We saw that senior IDF officials went off record with reporters in Europe, reporters in the US, went to meet with all sorts of officials, a real full court press on this issue, just to show really where Israel is standing on this, especially with the stalled Vienna nuclear weapons talks with Iran. But Israel's really trying to show, and it is extremely worried about the latest developments and the fact that, again, according to certain leaks and officials who remained anonymous, they said the Americans seem to be obsessed with bringing up settlements every time they want to talk about Iran. So that's obviously a concern here. In addition, what's also causing concern is reports are that Israel purchased refueling aircrafts that would be necessary for any sort of strike on Iran. And even though these have been purchased and Israel wanted them obviously sent over and moved up as soon as possible, now Israel is being told that they won't be delivered until 2024. And again, I stress the point that Israel believes, it's not just Israel, there's other players around the world who believe that Iran is weeks, months away from that threshold status of 90% enriched uranium. And now they're being told that a necessary piece of the puzzle to even have an option of a military strike on Iran's nuclear weapons facilities could take up to 2 more years. So there's obviously a little bit of, disgruntlement amongst Israeli officials on that particular level. Finally, just a little bit about Israeli politics. We're really back to the sort of fun and games, quote unquote, the coalition and opposition. It doesn't matter what issue comes up. If the opposition are supporting it, the coalition will stand against it, and vice versa. Some of the issues you would think would get wall-to-wall support really issues such as being able to supervise missile creating facilities to put extra safeguards. The opposition voted against, and likewise. So it's really causing neither side to compromise. Usually in normal times, there would certainly be times where opposition and coalition would vote against each other, even if it's an issue of mutual concern. But those are only rare circumstances. Here it's rare, extremely rare, that they will vote together on an issue. And it came to such a point that, and it caused a lot of consternation this week, that Shirley Pinto, member of Knesset Shirley Pinto from the Yamina Party, the first deaf MK, gave birth last Thursday, and she was drafted in already today or yesterday to vote, because simply, as we know, there's a 61-59 breakdown, and you had a couple of errant coalition members. You had Kara, who wasn't happy about the new Green Pass rules for those who are vaccinated being allowed into malls, and those who are not vaccinated not being allowed into malls. So he took some time off from the plenum, and so that put it down to a bare minimum. Without Pinto, then it would have been 59-59. Then when he returned, you had Taha of the Ram Party, who's not happy about what's called the electricity bill, that would provide the state provider of electricity would be also to unrecognized houses. That's something very important to the Arab community, to Ram. So the fact that they kept on having people sit out meant that Shirley Pinto had to be drafted in, because usually in these circumstances, when someone ill, someone can't make it to the Knesset, someone's abroad, they have an offsetting tradition where someone from the other side of the opposition would sit out to ensure that the person could grieve if it was for a loved one, get well if they're ill, give birth, get time off. But the opposition did not agree to give an offset for Shirley Pinto, so she had to turn up, and that, as you can imagine, caused a bit of a consternation. She turned up with her baby in the Knesset 5 days after she gave birth, and there she was voting. Benny Gantz and Naftali Bennett, both of them who traveled abroad last week. Benny Gantz, as I said, to Washington, and Naftali Bennett was the first prime minister to visit the UAE on a state visit, and both of them had to be brought in pretty much from the airport to the Knesset plenum. They had to sit in an isolated area and vote from the gallery. But that's what it takes these days, really, when they have such a slim majority and you have an opposition who's not prepared to offset their MKs, then that's the situation we're in. It's a very difficult situation. At one point, the coalition was going to decide to put off any of its votes because it didn't have the number. And that's when they decided to call in the new mother, Shirley Pinto. So politics has gone back to its combative self, and I'm sure that's the way it's going to be for the coming days and weeks. And with that, happy to answer any questions about those issues or any other.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question we have in is from Jerry Weiner. Are the attacks mostly in Judea and Samaria, or is it more widespread into Israel and the West Bank as well?
Well, Judea and Samaria are the West Bank. It's the same area. Again, if you ask people who live over the Green Line, there's attacks almost every day. There's rock throwing, there's Molotov cocktail launching of vehicles. There's all sorts of what some might argue minor attacks. These go on multiple times a day, but usually they don't make the media, even in Israel. But the stabbings that I was talking about, those are mostly happening in Jerusalem. Jerusalem seems to be where a lot of these places take place. As I said, the one on the Shabbat, the Sabbath, with the ultra-Orthodox one, the one that the video became famous, that happened just outside the old city. This stabbing of a mother with her children happened in Sheikh Jarrah, Shimon HaTzadik neighborhood, which is just outside the old city in East Jerusalem. So most of the attacks at the moment, the stabbing attacks, are taking place in Jerusalem.
Thank you. David Levine asks, regarding the refueling planes, is Israel working with its new Arab friends to arrange for refueling on the ground in the event of an Israeli attack on Iran?
There was talk about that a long time ago, even before relations, that there'd be flyover rights, there'd be assistance with refueling. It's certainly not something which is going to be openly said. There is actually, if anything, the Emiratis actually had a meeting with the Iranians this week. So, like all things, that, trying to sit a little bit on both sides and try to calm things down, discuss and cooperate. So it would be very unlikely you would find any of the Arab leaders, any of the Gulf Sunni leaders coming out openly and saying that it would give Israel active assistance in any possible military strike. So certainly if there was such assistance, it would be clandestine, be behind the scenes. It would be something that everyone would want to try and keep on the down low. So it's certainly not something that's being made public at this point.
Thank you. And Dr. Khan Lichi asks, regarding the government with the MKs voting more along the coalition versus opposition, how long will this government last if that continues? Is there any threat of the government failing because of that?
Well, I said a few weeks ago, now that the budget has passed, that the biggest threat has really been taken off the table, because there's only really a certain amount of ways that a government can fall. A government can not pass a single law for another 3-4 years, and it can still survive. That's not what can bring a government down. Not passing a budget in an appropriate amount of time, like we said, would cause immediate elections. A non-confidence vote could also bring down a government, but a non-confidence vote requires an alternative government, which means you need to have 61 seats with you. At the moment, the opposition, or at least the Netanyahu-led opposition, is 53 seats, because don't forget there's another 6 with the joint list who would not sit in a Netanyahu-led government. So at the moment, they're 8 shy of being able to put together a government for a no confidence vote. And until you have that, you can't really put a proper no confidence vote through. So that's not likely at this point. As I've mentioned before, really the only party that could eventually at one point flip to the other side because of the numbers and because of the possible nature of coalition politics is Benny Gantz's blue and white. He has 8 seats. Former Prime Minister, I should say, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been constantly talking up the chances of Benny Gantz. If he comes, he'll be Prime Minister. Again, that offer made the news this week. There's a lot of disquiet within the Likud of that, because again, you would see someone with a minority of seats, a small number, single figure seats, becoming Prime Minister. At the moment, they keep on reminding the coalition that it's been led by a Prime Minister with 6 seats. Well, Netanyahu is offering someone to be a Prime Minister with 8 seats, so it's not that much different, but they realize that's the only possible avenue to get to their 61, because some of those smaller right-wing parties do not have 8, whether it's Yisrael Beitenu, Yamina, or New Hope. None of those 3 are likely to move across, but even if they did, they would still be short. And the other parties, let's say Yesh Atid or Labour, are more to the left, so it's unlikely that they would ever be offered such a proposition, and they certainly wouldn't take it. So really the only possible party in that scenario is blue and white. Another way that government can end is if they pass a law to disperse Knesset, that you only need 61, or you actually need a majority. So it could be that some parties will abstain. But again, it would have to be there'd have to be a real breakdown in the coalition, and we're not there yet. I talked a little bit about what's called the electricity law, and it certainly was enough of a grievance for one of the MKs to sit out on some of the bills today, but the leader of the Ram party, Mansour Abbas, went on the TV later, some of the TV shows, and said, while the electricity law is very important for us, it doesn't deserve a stress on the coalition, and not every single disagreement within the coalition is going to lead to a coalition crisis. So certainly that calm tempers down a little bit. So at the moment, the government is pretty stable, even if there are disagreements, even if there are ideological differences. There's no real threat to it at this point. Things could change, certainly, but at the moment, the leaders of the parties seem to be working well together. Yes, there are differences. Yes, there are disagreements on Twitter. Sometimes these battles, like this week about Omer Bar-Lev's tweet, which I mentioned earlier, that took place on Twitter. This one attacked that one on Twitter, then the left attacked back, the right attacked back. But that's pretty much where it remained. It was more of a battle in the eyes of its ideological adherents, but not necessarily enough to do any damage, real damage to the coalition. So at the moment, the coalition is pretty stable. Will it live out its whole existence? I wouldn't put too much money on it. That remains to be seen. But at the moment, it's pretty stable.
Thank you so much. Larry Dunn asks, when the Security Cabinet has to make a decision on whether to attack Iran, will they bring Netanyahu into the decision-making?
Well, there is a rule that the opposition leader does get a security briefing. I believe it's monthly. Usually gets an update. The atmosphere between the Prime Minister and the former Prime Minister at the moment is pretty bad. I'm not sure exactly how much they're speaking. So that remains to be seen, but there's no legal or constitutional need to bring in the opposition leader, but and probably you want to, if again, this is a big if because we're not there or even close to being there at this moment, but if there would be a possible military strike, I think you would assume you would want as few people as possible to know. And again, not to make any aspersions on the former Prime Minister, but in this political atmosphere, some people could hear about it and want to make political hay. In the field of diplomacy or even security, there has been things which have been very problematic that that have been leaked, let's say. Again, I'm not saying that Netanyahu would do such a thing, but I think the atmosphere at the moment between the coalition and opposition probably means that I doubt that anyone outside a very small circle would be aware of such plans and necessarily be updated in real time to them.
Andy Palik asks, a report in today's Jerusalem Post is that Israel will suspend natural gas development for a period of time to focus on renewables. Can you give us some insight into the politics causing this action?
Yes, this is a policy by Minister of Energy, Water and National Infrastructure, Karen El-Harar, very much put a focus on renewable energy. Has been really, she traveled to the COP conference and spoke about the need, actually, because she's in a wheelchair. There was this whole thing, I don't know if you remember, she wasn't able to give the speeches. But she's put a lot of focus, and this government has put quite a lot of focus on renewables, on moving to renewable energy and trying to do away with waste and all that sort of thing. It did take a lot of people by surprise, this decision, but the government certainly is putting its money where its mouth is. Last week, Minister El-Harar was in the UAE, where she signed an agreement with Jordan, a real historic and unique agreement where Jordan would set up a massive solar field, because what Jordan has a lot of is territory, uninhabited territory, and Israel has growing energy needs, especially in electricity. So they would then give us electricity, and Israel in turn would give Jordan what it needs, which is above all water. It's probably the most arid country in the world, has the lowest amount of cubic meters of water per household in the world. So it was quite an interesting deal. It was quite a historic deal, trying to move to, certainly the solar panel fields is an attempt to move as much as possible across to renewables. There's talk of by 2050, where the majority of Israel's energy needs will be met by renewable energy. So it's not a major surprise, but probably quite a lot of people, especially in the opposition, were quite surprised by this. But then there's the argument that the whole sort of gas exploration hasn't really trickled down to the Israeli household level. There was a promise of sovereign wealth funds, there was promise of lower energy costs. None of these things materialized. So I think there'll be a certain amount of support for it, but there will certainly be a strong and robust opposition. I'm sure the debate will rage, but certainly this government with Karen El-Harar, Environment Minister Tamar Zandberg, really putting their footprint, the fingerprint, whatever you want to call it, on the Israeli government policies. And certainly there is a big push within the Israeli government to move to renewable energy. And this is probably one of the biggest manifestations of that policy.
Understood. Joy Wolf asks, what is happening to the tourist industry? Is this pretty much the same as the first lockdown, or is this different?
Well, Israel isn't in lockdown or anything close to, but certainly foreign tourists are not allowed, non-Israelis are not allowed into Israel with a few exceptions, first-degree relative celebrations, things like that. The tourism industry is in a lot of trouble. It was just starting to get back on its feet. Finance Minister Avigdor Lieberman got into a bit of trouble this week because during a closed cabinet meeting, it was leaked that he said it's about time that some of the people in tourism industry wake up and understand that maybe they have to be retrained or look for other jobs. He walked that comment back and he apologized for the phrasing of it, but it's certainly, the tourism industry, there was a lot of demonstrations outside the Knesset. It's on its knees, as you can imagine. Anything to do with that. And obviously there's a lot of industries which are affected by the tourism industry. Tourism industry, is a significant industry in Israel. And you can imagine, especially in the Christmas period with a lot of pilgrims, a lot of Christian visitors, is really going to hurt Israel even more so. But the policy at this point is, and they just extended it for at least another week, is that no tourists can come in. And at the moment, also, even leaving the country is difficult. They just added the UK, France, Spain, the UAE, and a few other countries to the red list, which means Israelis are forbidden from going to some of these other countries. So definitely, the tourism industry in Israel, like in many other places around the world, is certainly been brought to its knees during COVID.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week.
Absolutely.
For our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar on Turkey's dangerous new exports, regional instability, and pan-Islamist visions. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.